They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
All right, guys, we're back. I'm excited to jump into the subject matter. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you two... It's hard to really rank your favorite essays, in my opinion, or favorite like political pamphlets or whatever you kind of want to frame this sort of content as, but they certainly rank up there as my favorites. I think they're extremely important, and I think they're very easy to overlook. But before we jump into this, I guess I want to share a quote with you guys and then ask you, Adam, a couple questions. So, even the most stout-hearted libertarian occasionally despairs of saving freedom. At such times, this essay may afford encouragement. And that was from Albert J. Nock. He's the author of the first essay we're going to be talking about, Isaiah's Job. But essentially, what I want to explore with you guys, and maybe start off here with you, Adam, is if I was to say to you that the average person doesn't matter, and particularly they don't matter when it comes to changing the world, changing society, would that feel a little bombastic?
Yeah, I guess in a sense, like I would think that would be a little bit bombastic, because you would think that like and any person could be the average person, right? And so like if you took that thesis, I guess, to its like final conclusion, maybe like in that case, like nobody could ever matter. And that seems like, it seems like that can't be the case in a certain sense. Like I would think that at some point the average person becomes the exceptional person through some means of education or experience. And then, once that's occurred, like perhaps they can change the world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. And as we explore Albert J. Nock's essay, I hope that you'll maybe be convinced otherwise. Because I think for a lot of people, when they think about what's necessary for real change, right? How do we change the world? What sparks a real revolution or real fundamental change in the way we organize ourselves as a society? I think a lot of people, because they've been so indoctrined and so brainwashed by the pro-democracy propaganda, that they assume that we must wait until 50% plus one agree with us before we can really change course as a society. And that's not the case. Because understand, the average person is a follower. They're not a leader, right? They're not actually trying to drive things forward. In fact, they don't even care. And I'll share with you guys a quote from Albert J. Nock in a second, where he explores really what are the masses, who are the masses, and why they don't necessarily matter. But before we get into that, let's kind of couch this or frame this in a discussion about previous revolutions, right? Or previous big upheavals and change. One of my personal favorites, for a subject matter at least, is the American Revolution. And so, reminder, this is all based upon a Substack article that we published today. If you guys haven't checked us out on Substack, you can join for free, or you can even skip joining. You don't even have to give us your email. You just click the bottom thing where it's like, let me see first, and you'll be able to check out this article and every other article that we've read or wrote and shared here on Best Day Ever Media. I didn't write this like the perfect essay because, one, it's such a big, complex subject matter that honestly it was going to take me too long. I'll maybe go back eventually and write another essay, but I really wanted to have a nuanced and thoughtful conversation with you guys and with Adam in particular about this subject matter. But let's dive into the American Revolution first. So it's difficult to know with certainty what percentage of colonial America supported the revolution. One will often hear the anecdote that it was a war of the thirds. And what's meant by that is usually people will say about 1/3 of the colonial population supported the Patriots and Revolution. About 1/3 were Tories and loyal to Britain or loyalists, and 1/3 were indifferent or they were like fence sitters, right? They were trying to wait to see who won before they jumped in. Arthur R. Miller cites that at no time did more than 45% of colonists support the war, and at least a third of colonists sided with Britain. And the reason I bring this up is just, first of all, because understand the American Revolution, that didn't happen because 50% plus one of the population decided it needed to happen. It's really because a handful of individuals decided it needed to happen. And it happened a lot earlier than the moment the conflict started, right? So a lot of people think 1776, right? That's when it started. The Patriots of 76, all that stuff. No, it started far before that. It started with individuals like Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson writing political pamphlets, right? Pushing forward narratives and perspectives that challenged the status quo. And a lot of people, when you're thinking about challenging the status quo, it's easy to think that you need to talk to the masses, right? I need to dumb down my stuff to the point that every single person will understand me in order to capture that 50% plus one of the population. But again, if the vast majority of the population are actually followers rather than leaders, maybe you should be focused on capturing the leaders and not capturing the average person, because you can trust the leaders to lead, where the average person is simply going to want to follow you. And honestly, straight up, they probably don't have the complex mental capacities to really explore these in nuanced manners. And so, jumping over to Isaiah's job, actually, you know what? I'm going to keep going here first. So, further in regards to the American Revolution, it wasn't 50% of the population that decided to sign the Declaration of Independence, right? It was a handful of leaders that decided to do that. And that handful of leaders came together because they had a handful of leaders. In fact, you can probably think about this kind of like the Pareto principle, right? It's not about capturing 80% of the population. Maybe it's about capturing 20% of the leaders. Or maybe it's about capturing 20% of the 20% of leaders in order to really drive change and be effective in that regards. When we look at the colonial army, or the Continental Army, I should say, it's estimated that the Continental Army size was approximately 100,000. So this is like everyone that was properly in the Revolutionary Army. If you were to include militiamen, it's maybe estimated that's another 250,000, maybe as high as 400,000 individual in regards to colonists. And this is at a time when the population was estimated to be around 2.7 million in the colonies. So we can estimate that maybe 4% of the population were in the Continental Army. And this is where often you'll hear cited like the 3%ers, right? And the idea is the 3%ers were the 3% of the population that actively fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, the reason it's often cited as 3% instead of the 4% I mentioned here is that 3% is actually based upon the number of individuals that filed for army pensions. And not everyone necessarily filed for an army pension. So they usually end up with about 80,000 people when they're doing their estimate. But if we include the militiamen, who often were just like on the home front, right? They were defending the home front. They were acting as police. They were just trying to keep peace and order in general, oftentimes not seeing active conflict per se. That's about 15% of the population. And again, the reason it's important to highlight this stuff is to understand that you don't necessarily need to wait until you got that 50% plus one to try and really enact change on society. Taking a step further back here, let's think about the well, I guess it'd be a few steps forward, but let's think about the Haitian Revolution. If you guys have never been exposed to it's a long book, don't get me wrong, but if you've never been exposed to the Black Jacobins, fascinating in look or insights and look at the Haitian Revolution. And understand, there's something important to comprehend about the Haitian Revolution. It's literally the only large-scale slave revolt that's ever been successful in the history of humanity. The previous largest slave revolt was Spartacus. So you literally have to go back thousands of years before you're going to find another slave revolt. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie or read the books, it doesn't actually end well for Spartacus and the slaves that revolted. Rome didn't crumble because of that. Whereas with Haiti, they actually did succeed in it. And again, it wasn't that every single slave rose up in arms. It can often be a handful of individuals that light the spark. Think back, and again, I know historians will argue about this, but with the Civil War, right? A lot of people think that the Civil War essentially began with Abraham Lincoln being voted in and Kansas kind of being denied the ability to be a slave state and be a free state instead. However, throughout that period of time leading up to Abraham Lincoln's inauguration and election, you actually had bleeding Kansas, where you had people like I'm drawing a blank now. Is it Jim Brown? I think Jim Brown or John Brown. But essentially just decide to pick up arms and start trying to arm slaves in Kansas, start killing or attacking slave owners, and really trying to drive forward what they believed to be right? They weren't focused on the letter of the law. They were focused on what they believed to be the intention of the Constitution, and that every man was born equal and free. And so the reason, again, this is so important to understand the historical context here is when Jay Knock was actually writing this essay, he was writing it at a time when there was a lot of leading thought leaders that were trying to preach to the masses, right? They were trying to capture everybody's attention in order to push their political agenda forward. And in fact, I thought I highlighted this, but maybe it got deleted here. But essentially, oh, here we are. Perfect. So this is a direct quote from Isaiah's job. It occurred to me then that this story is much worth recalling, just now when so many wise men and soothsayers appear to be burdened with a message to the masses. Dr. Townsend has a message. Father Colin has one. Mr. St. Clair, Mr. Lipman, Mr. Chase, the Planned Economy Brethren, Mr. Tugwell and the New Dealers, Mr. Smith and the Liberty Leaguers. The list is endless. I cannot remember a time when so many energumens were so variously proclaiming the word to the multitude and telling them that they must do it to be saved. This being so, it occurred to me, as I say, that the story of Isaiah might have something in it to steady and compose the human spirit until this tyranny of wilderness is overpassed. I shall paraphrase the story in our common speech, since it has to be pieced out from various sources, and as much as respectable scholars have thought fit to put out a whole new version of the Bible in the American vernacular, I shall take shelter behind them, if need be, against the charge of dealing irreverently with the sacred scriptures. And so to summarize here, and I've got a few more quotes I want to share with you guys, but to summarize, essentially, this essay here, I believe it's like a fictional essay, but it's a great analogy to what's going on. And don't get me wrong, the historical context is true. But essentially, what Jay was saying here, or Mr. Knock was saying here in his essay, was the concept that a friend of his had this great political doctrine. He had this great treatise on economics. And in fact, it could revolutionize the world and make everyone better for it. And he went on to explain it. And Knox said, he asked for feedback and advice. And he was like, hey, man, it's great that you have these thoughts. And it's great that you want to try and share them with the average person. But understand the average person's probably literally too stupid to fully comprehend this shit. But take heart, not in the fact that you must dumb down your language, not in the fact that you must dumb down your message, but instead focus on speaking to the remnant. And so this is where Isaiah's job comes in. And so for people that aren't familiar with exactly who Isaiah was, the prophet, let's get into it. Alberta J. Knock, in his essay, Isaiah's Job, uses the biblical story of the prophet Isaiah to explain what the revolutionaries and defenders of liberty and free speech must undertake. Do not preach to the masses. Do not turn to the elites, but preach to the remnant. So this is a direct quote from the essay. The official class and their intelligentsia will turn up their noses at you, and the masses will not even listen. They will all keep on in their own ways until they carry everything down to destruction, and you will probably be lucky if you get out with your life. Isaiah had been very willing to take on the job. In fact, he had asked for it. But the prospect put a new face on the situation. It raised the obvious question: why, if all that were so, if the enterprise were to be failure from the start, was there any sense in starting it? Ah, the Lord said, you do not get the point. There is a remnant. There that you know nothing about. They are obscure, unorganized, inarticulate, each one rubbing along as best he can. They need to be encouraged and braced up, because when everything has gone completely to the dogs, they are the ones who will come back and build up a new society. And meanwhile, your preaching will reassure them and keep them hanging on. Your job is to take care of the remnant. So be off now and set about it. And so this is in regards to essentially the Lord telling the prophet Isaiah, I think back in like 740 BC, that he needed to go forward and preach the good word to Jerusalem. And at the time, it was essentially falling on deaf ears, and Isaiah was being discouraged, right, in regards to that experience. And the Lord said, you don't need to talk to everyone, but I tell you, in Jerusalem, there's at least 7,000 of the remnant there. And those are the people you should seek out. Those are the people you should speak to. You can preach to everyone, but no, you're only talking to them. And this is important for those of us right now that maybe feel like we're surrounded or we're completely immersed in clown world, right? Where up is down and left is right, and the government says one thing and does the opposite, and no one seems to be living in alignment with the values or the virtues that they constantly signal to their fellow man. And the reason this is important, not just for freedom and liberty, not just for Bitcoiners, but for anyone that wants to try and enact real change in the world, know that just because you get 10 views on your live stream, just because you get one retweet, just because 5 people subscribe to your Substack, that you should still move forward. You should still preach the good word, but you need to know that you don't need to dumb down your message. You need to speak to the remnant. And essentially, the second essay I want to explore with you guys in a second is in regards to Bitcoiners are the remnant, the masses don't matter, by Alexander Svetsky. But first, on Isaiah's job, again, it's just so important to understand this concept here because and again, paraphrasing such nuanced language, this is a very dense essay with a lot of historical context and great examples used. It's difficult to paraphrase. I really encourage you guys. There's a link in the Substack article where you can grab all these articles. They're all free. If you don't like reading, there's even a free audiobook version of this that you can either download or live stream off of the Mises.org Institute. But as you explore this and you start to really internalize this fact that it's not about convincing the masses, it's about convincing the remnant, because the remnant are the ones that will go forward and build the New Jerusalem. They're the ones that will go forward and build a better world because they're action takers. But what they are right now is unorganized. They're ill-informed. They feel alone, right? And this is something I've regularly talked about previously in other content I've created about trying to via game theory, essentially, create common knowledge. It's not just enough that you know the truth, but for a lot of people, they need to know that other people know the truth because that gives them courage. That gives them hope. That gives them the ability to actually move forward on that. And you don't need 50% plus one to build the new future, to build your utopia. And obviously, utopias don't actually really exist. But it's important to understand that you should still move forward on this. And you need to be selective, essentially, in who you preach to. So the last part of the essay here, in regards to Isaiah's job, one might suggest, therefore, the aspiring prophetical talent may well turn to another field. Sat patri primogo datum. Whatever obligation of the kind may be due to the masses is already monstrously overpaid. So long as the masses are taking up the tabernacle of Moloch and Chuan, their images, and following the star of their buncombe, they will have no lack of prophets to point the way that leadeth to more abundant life. And hence, a few of those who feel the prophetic afflatus might do better to apply themselves to serving the remnant. It is a good job, an interesting job, much more interesting than serving the masses, and moreover, is the only job in our whole civilization, as far as I know, that offers a virgin field. And this to me perfectly segues into the famous Breitbart quote, right? The idea that politics is downstream from culture. And culture is essentially dictated not by all of us, but by a handful of us, right? By influential individuals, by thought leaders. And that's what we need to be focused on if we want to enact real change. And in this just absolutely amazing article here, from Bitcoin Magazine, again, that was written in regards to Bitcoiners are the remnant, the masses don't matter. Mass adoption of Bitcoin isn't important. Selective adoption is, and always has been, how any revolutionary technology or transformation comes about. The masses will join by default. And honestly, I just found this a fascinating exploration that Alexander does in this essay. He references Isaiah's job a multitude of times. But when people are like, well, does the average person use Bitcoin, right? Does your mom use Bitcoin? Does your grandpa use Bitcoin? That doesn't matter. That's not who you should really be preaching to. Who you want to preach to is the builders, the people that will take up the fight, the people that will take up arms and try and push forward on what they truly believe is important. So below are some selective quotes from Alexander's essay. I mean, for 12 years, Bitcoiners have been laughed at, not just by the mainstream, but by blockchainers, shitcoiners, no-coiners, the media, governments, the intelligentsia, and even so-called freedom fighters like Chris Guy. Which, side note here, I love the fact he takes shots at Chris Guy because he says some weird bombastic shit here. And anyone that's in the Canadian freedom movement, you're probably familiar. Again, doesn't mean that he's wrong on everything, but he's suspect on a few things. And now, against the backdrop of a world genuinely going to hell, we're fighting to build a Noah's Ark so that the remnant can get out with their lives and rebuild. The best you have, the best you are, and the best you can be. This is not only what the remnant will produce, but what the remnant will demand. For every one remnant who gets it, there are tens of thousands of those in the masses who don't. And whether it's more nature or more nurture, it doesn't matter because the precise blend is impossible to know. What counts is that one in every 10,000 or 100,000 will always rise above the rest. The masses are generally on the wrong side of history because of the madness inherent in crowds. They only find themselves right when it's the default position, after the truth forged forth by the remnant finally prevails. By the time they figure out what's happened, the trend is over. The upside is gone. This is why the masses don't never have and never will take a difference, nor really matter. Or sorry, make a difference or nor really matter. By the time they're all finally using Bitcoin in the same way they breathe oxygen, the remnant will be building cities and citadels, terraforming new lands, and unlocking intergalactic energy and investing cosmic teleportation. The remnant are the 20% that make possible the 80% in Pareto's distribution. And don't fret, despite my tone, this is a story of hope for all. The masses will always benefit in the end, and a select few will rise to the occasion and join the ranks of the remnant. They shall be unplugged. And obviously, that's a reference to the Matrix, right? Again, understand that Neo and Morpheus, they weren't the majority of individuals, right? You didn't need to get 50% plus one of the people in the Matrix to tear down the Matrix. You needed a handful of hardcore supporters that were going to push forward, right? People that truly believed in the ideology. And again, this is something that I really take and find hope in because it means that I don't need to get millions of people watching my live streams. It means that I need to speak to, at most or at minimum, an audience of one. I need to convince one of the remnant to understand that there is hope, that we can build a better future. And yeah, I like, again, there's so many different ways we could take this conversation. One last thing I want to point out is I tried to take my own take on this on my blog, and there's a link again in the Substack article to it in regards to Watch Out Western Man. And I kind of own this fact right off the bat that I was trying to speak to the remnant. I'm well aware that my title alone will have triggered some to automatically judge me and the contents of this essay. So be it. They are not the audience I seek to reach. But let's be clear on one fact. Western Man, at least in terms of this essay, is meant to represent Western classical liberalism and its ideals. Your philosophers explored social contracts, not social states. And yeah, again, I encourage you guys, go check out all three of these articles. Obviously, if you're only going to read one or two, read the other ones. You can skip mine. But I think it's important to understand we don't need to convince the masses. We don't need to preach to everyone. We need to preach to the remnant. If you want to really enact change, if you want to change the world, you can lead by example and convince a small group of individuals, right? Understand that this isn't just true in the American Revolution. The same concept of the remnant was explored way before J. Albert Nock ever thought of doing it. We've seen it from Plato, Marcus Aurelius, right? We see it in regards to Isaiah the prophet. And again, this is a pattern that seems to repeat itself in history, that it's a handful of individuals that change the world. It's not the masses. The masses are slow to adopt. And we should actually take heart in that. Because even if right now it feels like you're pushing up against an immovable object and you're in between a hard place, that doesn't mean that there's not hope, and that doesn't mean that you won't eventually be able to enact the change that you want to see in the world. So yeah, I guess rant over here, Adam. Kind of want to open things up to you and just get your thoughts or feedback on this. I know that Isaiah's job, Bitcoiners are the remnant, are probably new essays to you. Not sure if you checked out my Western Man essay back when I originally posted it, which was, I looked at it just kind of like, funnily enough, it was October 12th, 2021. And that was at a moment in time when I was really frustrated with the world because I felt like I saw something that a lot of people were either actively or ignorantly ignoring. And it was driving me crazy in regards to what I considered to be some of the financial consequences that we're starting to see play out now, as well as some of the social consequences, right, and social dynamics that are playing out in regards to things like the Freedom Trucker Convoy protests.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot to unpack there in 25 minutes of reading through these guys' work and your own thoughts. One of the things that I don't feel satisfied yet on with these essays is like, how, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but like, how do you believe you can best find other remnants, right? Like, because like what we're doing here, right, is obviously a clear attempt for us to collect these types of thinkers, or at least shed light that these are our ideas, right? But like, I guess with Isaiah's job, the instructions there were actually to go out and preach this shit to as many people as possible, right? Like, he was told to, at reading through that essay, he was allegedly told, because I haven't read this actual passage, but he's told to, like, go talk to the paupers, and the riches and everybody else, and that, like, literally some very small portion of those people are going to be the remnants. But like, do you see a better or more effective way than, like, say, the strategy we're deploying today to try and just put this out on the internet? Like, how else would you go about finding these thought leaders? Because I feel like that is a challenge to the mediums that we use, where, like, if it truly is the leaders that we need to collect, I'm not certain that even this format is going to necessarily collect those people, right? Like, how do you get people of influence to pay attention to you when your message is so detrimental to their own personal interests? Like, if I take the average like Doug Ford, for example, on a story that we just talked about, right? He's going to abstain from testimony, even though, like, maybe it has to do with his own personal beliefs. But like, how do you get these leaders who have influence, real influence, and can collect followers to listen to you, and more importantly, to be bold enough to join you in the remnant cause? Like, do you have thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah. I think that, like, as kind of the parable with Isaiah is laid out, it's enough to raise the flag. It's enough to preach, and that those individuals, while ignorant now, that will eventually belong to the remnant, they will see with time, right? And again, maybe it's not you that collects them. Maybe you inspire one individual that goes on to be a better preacher than yourself and is able to really draw more people into the fold. I think that leading by example is the absolute key to all of this. Living in alignment with your principles, not essentially compromising on things that you don't believe should be compromised upon. Right? Think of how many people were just berated, barraged, completely overwhelmed by mass media hysteria around the COVID narrative. And yet a handful of individuals just knew that this wasn't right, that they weren't going to give in to medical tyranny. And think of, like, how slowly you might, like, for those individuals that maybe were like, no, I'm not going to get a vaccine just because the government told me to. I want to see more data. Or I want to see a justification for why me, as like a 37-year-old healthy male, needs to take this medical intervention when I don't really see or understand the need for it. And how, for a lot of us that maybe spoke out even briefly on social media, you'd get one DM of, yo, man, I can't say anything publicly, but like, I agree with you. I think that's how you build courage. That's how you build a following. I'm drawing a blank on the book right now, but essentially there's a book that I know we did in our book club that talks about the leader is almost less important than the first follower, right? And that
Yeah.
mass movements are often triggered by the second follower, and they go on to enact crazy change, right? Like, think about Jesus, right? And 12 disciples. He was willing to preach to everyone, but it was honestly those 12 disciples that really pushed things forward. And then it was Paul hanging out with those 12 disciples that led to Paul essentially building the Christian church as we know it today. And that all was just a handful of individuals. Sure, he preached to the masses. Maybe they listened, maybe they didn't. The fact that he was eventually killed for his beliefs probably tells you that the masses weren't in alignment with his message at that point in time. But eventually they did adopt to it. And I just want to share this one quote here that I didn't originally share from Isaiah's job. The line of differentiation between the masses and the remnant is set invariably by quality, not by circumstance. The remnant are those who, by force of intellect, are able to apprehend these principles, and by force of character are able, at least measurably, to cleave to them. The masses are those who are unable to do either. And so, again, I think it's very rare the individual that's going to be willing to stand up. I think individuals can think of that meme, right? Of the taskmaster with the whip at the front and everyone's kneeling down, and then one dude at the front stands up, and then a handful of dudes stand up, and then eventually you've got everyone standing up. And it's because that person led by example and led from the front by choosing to stand up and take the risk.
In
So
that
yeah,
particular visual or example, Matt, I can see a very clear incentive for the remnant, right? If you were the one who first stood in front of a whip and then were joined by just a few, and then perhaps that turns to many. I I am challenged to reason through my own head why the average person would be incentivized to stand up to something like because it's so fresh and recent. I think the COVID narrative thing is just like
yeah,
how we have to think about this stuff because it's just front of mind. But like, you know, the average guy who had to go to work to maintain his income, to hold on to his property, to hold on to his family's livelihood, to in order for like literally the way I frame it is like sustenance. Like that man had very, very little incentive to stand up, right? It would have been so much more reward in the short term to just to fold than it would be to stand up. And like, I guess
well,
in
and to
your
build
example
upon
of the
that,
whipping, like it's very clear the incentive, right? But like the incentive to you or I, who actually were, I would say, extremely principled throughout the COVID um, kind of years, right? Like we were very clear that we were never going to get vaccinated. We were very clear that like the mask shit was bullshit once that was figured out. We were very clear that like we had an obligation to share our story, but like there was never really a clear incentive, I don't think, like to publicly be saying these things. Like, in fact, it probably lost us. And again, if we're going to paint them all as the messes, then those losses are both to be expected and also not very like it should. It's almost moot, right? Right? It's like a moot point that we lost those masses, but at the same time, like for sure it would have harmed our public credibility, image, all this other shit that you would have happen if you choose to be the remnant. And like immediately, I don't see an obvious upside other than the fact that we get to live principled and feel like we did the right thing. Like outside of that, like, and if that's your only thing, like we were extraordinarily fortunate in that both of us had the finances and the willingness and ability and all that other stuff in order to be that person. But like, I don't see the clear benefit to the masses essentially to get them on board, because
well,
if they had done that, they would have been fucking whipped.
I would argue that that's the whole point of the essay.
Exactly.
You'll never convince them until they essentially convince themselves. And so again, it's like trying to talk your and again, like there'll be edge case scenarios here, but like I can remember trying to tell my parents about the internet and why it was useful. But it wasn't until all my dad's friends were using the internet and talking about like the horse races, which he loved to keep track of, that he was like, okay, can you show me this internet thing? Because my buddy is constantly talking about how he can check the stats on the horse races faster than I can get it on the television.
Yep.
And so I think like that in and of itself describes the situation here. And to your point that like the average dude working a job that needs to get by won't be able to stand up or the incentives won't be there. Again, I don't disagree with that. But I can think of I know of an individual that I would count amongst the remnant. I won't dox him now, but he's a good friend of mine, known him since like before kindergarten sort of thing, works in a trade, and they got an email from their company that said like you have to be vaccinated. It is what it is. And him and a bunch of fellow employees had talked about it, and they'd all said like, no, not going to get it. A bunch of them caved. He didn't. And the reason he didn't is because, in my opinion, he's part of the remnant. And as like that quote I previously shared said, through sheer intellect, right? And
Yep.
commitment to your principles, he wouldn't. But with that, naturally, even if you may not identify yourself as a leader, that you've got some leadership qualities to you, right? And that individual is going to know their worth. So he was just like, okay, well, consider this my resignation. And he'd worked his way into an important position at that company. It didn't come with a fancy title. There was nothing like that. But like the shop couldn't function effectively without him. And so they were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. The owner of it like sent an email back immediately to him and said, like, let's not overreact to this. Let's take this conversation offline and see if we can't find something that works for everyone. And he was like, well, the only way it's going to work is if you literally don't enact this policy. And his wife, again, I would also place her amongst the remnant, because when it came to masking her children, she just wrote a letter to the school that was like, nope, Under no circumstances will my child wear a mask. Under no circumstances will you force my child to constantly use antibacterial soap, right? Like they're not going to be constantly just rubbing their hands. I forget the brand, but you know the brand that's like,
Purell.
yeah, with Purell. She was just like, no, they won't do it. And if you've got an issue with that, come speak to me. And so their daughter was the only person going to this school that wasn't wearing a mask, that when they went in and out from recess didn't have to use Purell. And again, that maybe changed no one else's minds, but those people are part of the remnant, in my opinion, because they are willing to lead by example. The person that's living as a wage slave, paycheck to paycheck, they've already just adopted the mass movements, right? Like they're literally a sheep trying to stick in the herd so that they don't stand out. And so, like, if the herd goes off a cliff, they'll go off the cliff. If the herd goes to greener pastures, they'll go to those greener pastures. And it's going to be the couple sheep at the front that end up actually driving and leading where that herd ends up going. And so I think, again, that to me really just hits upon everything here. But I want to share with you another quote here from Isaiah's job. If a writer, you aim at getting many readers. If a publisher, many purchasers. If a philosopher, many disciples. If a reformer, many converts. If a musician, many auditors. Which is funny because you can tell how old this is because no one would reference a music listener as an auditor, and so on. But as we see on all sides, in the realization of these several desires, the prophetic message is so heavily adulterated with trivialities in every instance that its effect on the masses is merely to harden them in their sins. Meanwhile, the remnant, all aware of this adulteration and of the desires that prompt it, turn their backs on the prophet and will have nothing to do with him or his message. And this to me, um, I definitely run an anarchist and libertarian like thought circles, right? And so again, in any sort of like political niche, you're going to hear the term grifter. And what is a grifter? A grifter, in my opinion, and I think majority of people's opinions, is someone that pretends to live in alignment with a certain set of principles, but their primary goal is to get the biggest audience. It's to make the most amount of money, right? It's to sell the most number of books. And the individual that's principled will take a completely different path than that grifter. And so again, like you can find grifters in the right, the left, the center, doesn't really matter. But they're individuals that will flip flop on issues, right? Like one year they're for fracking, the next year they're against fracking, right? 10 years ago, they tell you they'll never ban handguns and take your guns away. 10 years later, they've got no issue with doing that. Those are individuals that, again, they're not part of the remnant. They never will be because they're grifters, right? They prefer to talk to the masses, not because that's where the best conversations are had. That not because that's where the edges of society are pushed forward, but instead that's where the safety lies, right? Is in that herd mentality. So yeah, really appreciate that question, but hopefully that kind of helps navigate at least I think their thoughts as well as my thoughts on the subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like in general, I think I fully agree with the position of these essays as well as your own. And I do find it interesting that the people that would be part of the remnant class, like they're often some of the most successful. And I think that's where the incentive actually lies because they're able to chase their passion and carve out their little niche. Like as you were speaking there about grifters, I was thinking about, well, who's a great example of somebody that's the opposite of that. And I recently listened to a discussion with Rick Rubin, who's the producer of so many, like just fucking killer, killer music productions like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Public Enemy, The Cult, Danzig, Kanye West, the Beastie Boys, Black Sabbath, Johnny Cash. And these are musicians and sounds and pieces of work that were so controversial and so like just out there, right? It was new, it was original, it was art for the sake of art, right? And I believe that somebody like that would fit into this category and obviously would reap the rewards of that type of behavior by sticking to like what they were truly principled in and passionate about and just making it. And if you listen to this interview, it's on Joe Rogan Experience number 1881. And this interview is very telling, right? It was like, it was never about the money. It was never about the fame. It was never about the number of audience members or how many people they could put in a stadium. That was a byproduct of staying principled and just making truly beautiful art. And I think that this is where, to answer my previous question, like this is where being the remnant can be incentivized, right? Like you have the opportunity to follow your principles into a space where you're potentially rewarded for that later, right? And even if you face ostracization in the present.
Well, and one thing, like, I don't disagree with you on, but I want to add additional context. When you said that the remnant will often be the most successful, I agree, but on their terms. So they may not literally
Yes.
write the absolute best-selling book. They may not literally write the greatest song or the most bought or played song of all time, but they understand their principles. They understand their terms of engagement and how they define success, and they live in alignment with that, right? So, like, again, you don't even necessarily have to agree. And like, there's obviously going to be remnants in all sorts of different aspects of society, but like the remnant isn't the person that goes to a, communist, socialist sort of like uh, protest and then is wearing Nikes and drives home in their mass produced car and lives in their McMansion, stuff like that. It's the person that decides that they're going to start a co op and they're literally going to try and live off the earth and invite other individuals and try and create their own version of society, right? It's the individual that, like Kanye West, that might zig and zag and it might even look confusing to the outside observer, but they're truly living in alignment with themselves, and that's where like true innovation occurs as well, is on the edges of society. It's rarely going to come from the center, because the center again is where the safety is. And one other thing, one more quote I want to share with you guys, and then we can wrap up if we don't have anything else to say on the subject matter. But Isaiah, and again, this is from Albert J. Nock. Isaiah, on the other hand, worked under no such disabilities. He preached to the masses only in the sense that he preached publicly. Anyone who liked might listen. Anyone who liked might pass by. He knew that the remnant would listen. And knowing also that nothing was to be expected of the masses under any circumstances, he made no specific appeal to them, did not accommodate his message to their measure in any way, and did not care two straws whether they heeded it or not. As a modern publisher might put it, he was not worrying about circulation or about advertising. Hence, with all such obsessions quite out of the way, he was in the position to do his level best, without fear of favor, and answer only to his august boss. The remnant, on the other hand, want only the best you have, whatever they may be. Give them that, and they are satisfied. You have nothing more to worry about. The profit of the American masses must aim consciously at the lowest common denominator of intellectual taste and character among 120 million, today it would be 350 million people. And this is a distressing task. I think, again, that's something where I find so much hope in this language and this train of thought, because again, and I know like you're a big fan of Luke Fiasco, right? And he talks about
Yeah.
like, you got to dumb it down,
Dumb
Luke,
it
in one of
down.
his songs. And it's like, well, no, maybe you don't, right? Like, again, it depends on how you define success. But if success to you is creating the best art you're capable of, you never have to dumb down that art. And you will find ways to reframe success for yourself, right? And again, like literally, in my opinion here, anyone can stumble upon these YouTube videos. Anyone can choose to try and make their life better, to try and have the best day ever. But really, this show is as much about you and me preaching to each other to try and drive each other to become better versions of ourselves, to become greater thinkers, more intellectual, all the different aspects of life, versus trying to convince every single person that they need to buy a sauna or that they need to do this, that, or the other. It's like, no, it's about us confirming amongst ourselves, right? And again, it's important to understand the social dynamics of the average person, right? You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I'd much rather find myself amongst the remnant than versus the masses. And I think that that's honestly true even of a larger portion of the population than likely makes up the remnant. I think that there are individuals in the masses that can become the remnant, but first they have to be captured by ideas. I think that the most captivating ideas aren't watered down, they're not distilled, they're pure, right? And it's like, it's the sort of thing of like Michael Malice gets called out on being an anarchist, right? And people are like, well, why don't you live in the woods? Like, why aren't you literally trying to overthrow the government right now? And he very intellectually and honestly will explore that and say, listen, anarchy, right? Freedom is my top priority. It's not my only priority, right? There's other values that I have. And so there's trade offs to be made there. But I actively choose to engage in those trade offs rather than simply bow down to the masses. And that maybe sounds nuanced, or maybe even sounds like, to the casual observer, like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. But I think if you spend some real time and think about it, you'll come to the realization that, oh no, he's defining success how he sees fit, and he's playing the game within it, right?
Yeah, and also attracting, people of like Spade to himself. Like he's definitely, by preaching that message, those people that agree with his values and feel like they identify with those values as well have been absolutely attracted to him, and he's found success in that way. So yeah, I mean, I can't fault that. And I certainly, that last quote was, particularly relevant, I would think, to this show, right? Where it's like, we're doing this, whether there's going to be 10 views or 100 million views. And either way, it doesn't really matter. And we've had talks in the past, right? Where we discuss, for under no circumstance will we become somebody else in order to farm engagement, right? It's like we will do this
Mm-hmm.
show with our highest quality that we can put out and with the highest level of truth that we can put out. And that's how we're going to produce this show, whether anybody ever watches this. And in fact, if you're watching this right now, just know that there are 0 live concurrent viewers at the moment on YouTube or Facebook or anything.
At
And we're
least
still
Rumble says
having
we
this
have 2.
discussion. Well, excellent. Our 2 bots are still here. So, but seriously, like I really respect this train of thought and like the intellectual exploration that we get to do on this show with each other, because I know that there is going to be one other person that watches this, right? And we found that out already. And so I'm excited by that fact, and I'm excited by the fact that we aren't alone. And it's also for me, like one of the most rewarding things over the last 2 years has been to find out that there are other people like yourself, Matt, that are principled enough to stand up for their shit. Like that to me is perhaps the biggest white pill we can have, in that, like, if only it was the two of us in the entire world that were principled enough to stand up for our shit, we at least did it. And that to me is like, that is like it gives me chills right now, because it's like it honestly, I believe it only does take one person to start that, right? And the second person is absolutely mental for following the one person, but everyone after that, it becomes more and more appropriate to follow. So I'm really excited that we're here and that
Yeah.
we can say we stuck to our principles, man.
And then one last point on this is, like, look towards 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale, and maybe to a lesser extent Brave New World. But understand that, again, even though Winston Smith, right, didn't go on to be successful in causing the revolution, it was literally just the knowledge that there was at least one other dissident out there like him that gave him the hope, right, that allowed him to fight for as long as he did against the machinery. And that form of subversion, that form of like political protest, may be very small actions, right, but they're actions that he actively chose to take regardless of the consequences. In The Handmaid's Tale, spoiler alert, though it's a pretty old book, so I don't think there's a lot to be said here. Well, again, like with Winston Smith, I kind of arguably spoiled that book as well. But with The Handmaid's Tale, again, with the posterity of the last chapter where they explored the historical concept, it wasn't that I don't even remember the organization now, but essentially the resistance in that society, they weren't large. It wasn't that every household had a dissident in it. It was that there was a handful of individuals, and they each gave each other strength, and they were able to create that underground railroad to Canada or the UK. And it was just knowing that there was at least one other like kindred spirit out there that gave them strength, that gave them hope. And while we don't know exactly how that society collapsed, it's never purely laid out in the book. It's still important to understand the context there, right? That like sticking to your principles, I think it's as important as it's ever been. And it will always be important to the remnant. And you only really want to be speaking to like good faith actors, in my opinion, right? Like people that actually care about these things versus trying to trick someone. I don't think you can trick someone into your political ideology, right? I don't think, again, even I would argue socialists, communists, those on the left often try and trick or incentivize with, carrots and sticks in order for people to oblige themselves to that preferred policy. But it only lasts for so long. right? You eventually see the Berlin Wall crumble. And sometimes it takes far longer than we'd like to see the next era, to see real change enacted. But it is still there on the horizon as long as there's at least one dissident out there.
Yeah, I mean, exciting and thoughtful, provoking discussion here today, Matt. So, yeah, I mean, thank you very much for introducing me to these essays, and I'll absolutely take the time to go back and read them fully when I've got a moment and full focus on them. But I thought that this discussion was one of our best to date. So, very excited by that prospect and to see where we can take this from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you guys watching. Smash the like, leave us comments, share on social, all that good stuff. Definitely consider joining our Substack, become part of our little remnant here. Join the Telegram chat, share your thoughts, your opinions, your stories you think we should be covering as well, because we really do appreciate that. And I'd like to think that this is important. Again, whether it's for an audience of 1 or an audience of 1 million. And those of us that can't help ourselves have a duty to try and move forward on this political discourse. So appreciate you guys. That's all I've got to say.
Awesome. Well, that was our Cheaper Than Therapy Wednesday show on history and politics. Tomorrow is going to be a little more lighthearted because that's our random hobbies and interests show. And for the Thursday show, we're actually going to be discussing how to improve the accuracy of your rifle. And I'm going to be discussing why that's an important thing if you're interested in becoming a hunter, if you're already a hunter, or if you just simply want to play around with rifles for sport. I'm going to be exploring a couple reasons why that is important. It's not all just about bragging rights to your buddies that you can shoot a better grouping or that you can hit that bullseye from a certain distance. But I'm going to explore with you why I believe it's important to be ethical, right? And as a hunter, you really want to be ethical if you're going to take another animal's life. They may not be conscious, they may be, I'm not really sure, but if you're going to make that decision, you better make it count, and you do not want to have any mistakes made from that perspective. So I'm going to teach you all about how to improve the accuracy of your rifles. And, of course, that has nothing to do with the Remnant discussion, but I believe that part of having the best day ever is being a well-rounded individual in both your intellect and your ability to execute. And I think that this is a part of that. And so I'd like to share that hobby and my personal interest with you. And, maybe it will inspire you to pick up a rifle and shoot for sport, or maybe even provide sustenance for your family, friends, and community. So looking forward to that discussion, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day, and I hope you have the best day ever.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.